It is December 12th, 1936. Chiang Kai-shek is in his cabin at the Northwest Army headquarters in Xi'an when bodyguards of the young Marshal Zhang Zhilang and Yang Ho-chang burst through the door and detained the Director General. The Nanjing government was then informed that they were going to have to end the war against the CPC and purge any pro-Japanese sentiment from the government and take a defensive anti-Japanese attitude. By the 16th, Zhou Enlai and fellow negotiator Lin Baku arrived, trying to make a compromise with Chiang. Upon meeting Chiang for the first time since leaving the Whampoa Military Academy 10 years previous, Zhao stated, "In the 10 years since we have met, you seem to have aged very little," which Chiang, ever charismatic, stated, "And Lai, you are my subordinate, you should do what I say." Surprisingly, this has a happy ending in which the CPC agreed to follow Chiang's rules so long as they resisted the Japanese. A united front was formed. Speaking of happy endings, Zhang would be put under house arrest for 50 years before moving to Hawaii in later life, and Yang would be arrested and later executed for these actions. Yay! The two factions would not have to wait long for their trial by fire, as on the night of July 7th, 1937, on the Marco Polo Bridge outside of Beijing, everything would come to a head. It all started with the Japanese forces on the Japanese-controlled side of the bridge demanding to be led into the small town on the Chinese side of the border. The Chinese forces refused, and lo and behold, shots were fired and the two began fighting. Their newfound resilience, the nationalist government and the expansive Japanese empire decided that now was the time, now was the turning point. It is time for the Second Sino-Japanese War. Almost all of the Chinese warlords and political entities would rally behind the nationalists, including the communists, and would oppose the Japanese by any means necessary. However, looking at the military quality and centralization the Japanese held the clear advantage, seeing the fall of Beijing and Tianjin within the first month of the conflict. This would also see collaborationist Chinese forces murder 260 civilians living in Tongzhou in a mutiny, which would be great for the general Japanese public to get behind the war on the pretext of protecting Japanese citizens living in China. The next battle would begin with another incident between the Japanese and Chinese, the Oyama incident, where a Japanese lieutenant, Isao Oyama, attempted to get into the Hongqiao airport by speeding past the gate. As the Chinese guard attempted to stop the lieutenant, he sped up and shot the guard to death. This then resulted in Oyama himself being shot and killed. This led to both powers boosting forces in Shanghai, and conflict was nigh. There was an attempt from Western powers to defuse the situation, but negotiation was fruitless, and the war was to spread to the Chinese heartland as well. Starting on the 13th of August, the Chinese forces in the city traded fire within several of the city's districts. The Japanese would push into the city to meet the best troops the nationalists had to offer. This would be their Stalingrad, as later historians put it. The plan of attack was to use overwhelming numbers of the nationalist forces under Zhang Zhichong to push the Japanese forces back to the Huangpu River by capturing the Japanese army headquarters at Zanbei and the Kungta textile mill, where the naval command was stationed. This resulted in a standstill when faced with Japanese fortifications near the Shanghai International Settlement, which the nationalists lacked the heavy arms to destroy. They would push onwards anyway, deciding to encircle the positions instead, but the surprise attack was no longer a surprise. This would work until the Japanese deployed tanks, which, like the fortifications, were not easily dispatched by the Chinese forces, and the attack was halted. The new plan was to attack the Huishan docks on the north side of the Huangpu River. One Chinese division would break through the Japanese lines at Yangpu and meet up with the Chinese tank division at the Huishan docks, but were unable to hold on due to the lack of infantry tank tactics, with the tanks speeding ahead. The remaining infantry was destroyed between the machine gun and flamethrower fire. By the 22nd of August, the Japanese landed 3 divisions in towns about 31 miles away from the city center. This meant that the Chinese troops deployed to the city center had to be redeployed to the coast to counter the landings. This led to a stalemate, with the Chinese only gaining the downtown districts for 3 months until the situation would become untenable. The second phase of the battle would begin when the Japanese realized they would need backup and landed 4 divisions among other troops to deal with the resistant Chinese forces holding the city. They would land after a naval bombardment in the coastal towns that had up until then been defended by Chinese fortifications. They would be reinforced by more troops doomed to be only equipped with small arms. They would valiantly hold the Japanese for as long as they could, seeing gains and losses at great cost. One battle that would encapsulate this struggle was the struggle for Baoshan, where only 1 Chinese soldier survived the battle. The next struggle was for Luidan, which would take up the rest of September, which was a vital junction between center city Shanghai and the surrounding town, which, if it were to fall, would split Shanghai and Suzhou. The German advisor to the Chinese troops, yes, those Germans, Alexander von Falkenhausen, stated that the town could not fall. The Chinese deployed about 300,000 troops there to face the 100,000 Japanese. The fighting was brutal, seeing many die on either side, though the Chinese suffered greater casualties, with a rate of greater than 50% lost. Eventually, they had to pull out. The Japanese, wanting to seize the opportunity, decided to push into Deqiang, as they could then possibly encircle the Chinese troops in downtown Shanghai. Thus the Chinese resisted, and the 2 armies would grind to a stalemate. The Japanese won the battle through their usual superior firepower, turning the town into rubble. This resulted in the withdrawal from downtown Shanghai, and a general withdrawal from the city center would commence. This would be the orders for all but 1 battalion of the 88th Division to remain in Zaibei to hold the Zihang warehouse. Zaibei was set ablaze, not only by fire from the Chinese retreat, but from the actions of those holding the warehouse opposite the Shanghai International Settlement. It was time to fight for what they believed in. This was the true Stalingrad, the Alamo, der Verdun, their story. The general idea that Chiang Kai-shek had was to show Chinese courage, buy some time for the troops to withdraw, and hope that the 9-power conference would lead to Western powers intervening in China. The 524th Regiment of the 88th Division were to hold on to the Zihang warehouse for as long as possible. They would be under the command of Zi Jinwan, who volunteered for the position. They would fortify and prepare for the Japanese onslaught. The Japanese forward elements would approach the warehouse and attack from the west. They would take cover in what they thought was a safe spot, only to be relentlessly peppered by the machine guns on the roof of the warehouse. The Japanese would set fire to the northeast corner of the warehouse, which the Chinese would put out. Believing that the fighting was over for the day, Zai let his men eat and repair the fortifications. The next day would see Japanese planes fly over the warehouse with intent to bomb it, but being so close to the international settlement has its perks, as they could not safely hit it. They would attack from the western side of the factory, but they were forced to retreat when it proved futile, though they were able to isolate the warehouse by cutting its electricity and water. This wasn't as big as a setback as you might think, as the one side of the warehouse was left open due to the British keeping the new Lisi Bridge open, warning the Japanese, and supplies were donated to the Chinese. Xi struck a deal that the wounded would be evacuated to the international settlement by the British. It was the 19th when the beleaguered Japanese would order an all-out assault. They would shell the warehouse, bring in tankettes, and even ladders. The Chinese resistance was exemplified by a traumatized soldier, who jumped off the warehouse with grenades strapped to him, detonating and killing 20 Japanese soldiers. The brutal fighting would continue for the rest of the day, with the Japanese attempting to dig underneath the warehouse. In the words of Su Meiling, Chang's wife, stated that they must die so China can live. The question, why did not withdraw the men to the settlement where they would be safe? The 30th of October would see renewed artillery bombardments to crush the Chinese force. While all this was going on, Chang was in discussion with the British to allow the Chinese forces to withdraw, which he finally relented. 376 men plus Z managed to escape under machine gun fire to the international settlement out of the 414 men who initially manned the warehouse. This would not last long, as the Japanese demanded their release of their prey, only allowing them to leave as refugees, and being faced with 300,000 troops surrounding the settlement, they were fenced off and held in custody, and on the 24th of April, 1941, Xi was assassinated by 4 of his own men who were collaborating with the Wang Jingwei regime. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the men would be seized by the Japanese and sent to hard labor, where some went to Papua New Guinea revolted against their Japanese captors later in the war. Being about 190 miles from Shanghai, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, was now under threat. The exhausted Chinese troops were beaten back at all points between Shanghai and Nanjing. There were two philosophies on what to do with the nationalist capital, one led by Li Zhongren, which believed deploying forces to the city would be pointless, preferring leaving Nanjing an open city but destroying anything they could not take with them while they left. The German advisor von Falkenhausen and General Bai Chengxi agreed with this plan. Chiang, however, was against the plan and assigned General Tang Xinxi the unenviable task of holding the city, as the nationalist government moved its capital to Chongqing. The fighting would begin on the 10th of December, with an offer for the Chinese surrender to be refused. The Japanese would sustain heavy casualties trying to make it past the defenses, but their superior firepower was able to break the gates of the city. Tang decided that they would all leave through the north gate, the only one they still controlled, without informing all of his troops. This resulted in a mass panic among the conscript as their officers were suspiciously disappearing. This led to looting and the attempt to conceal themselves as civilians, and a shootout between the guards at the northern gate, who had not been told to retreat, and the frenzied troops who thought they were deserting. While this disaster was going on, an international one was brewing when Japanese planes sank the USS Panay, a gunboat on the Yangtze. Tang was then trying to get the evacuation of his troops across the Yangtze, but he did not account for something: masses of civilian refugees fleeing as well. This resulted in many being trampled to death or being consumed by the flames of fire. The Japanese then took the city. Of course, the suffering of the people of Nanjing was far from over, as once the Japanese had sacked the city for anything useful, an orgy of the worst mankind has to offer followed. Those who were shot to death were lucky, as for those who survived faced far worse. Many were bayoneted to death, burned alive, crushed by tanks and tankettes, being buried alive, or decapitated. That was not all the Japanese had to offer, as some were nailed to doors, castrated, or disemboweled. However, the defining moment of this act of man-made inhumanity was the rapes, with over 20,000 occurrences, with victims ranging from the young and the old, but simply defiling them was not enough. Many had bayonets and other foreign objects penetrate them. It did not matter if you were pregnant, where your fetus might be ripped out, or if you were a son who was then forced to rape their mother and promptly shot afterwards. As one can imagine, many could not go on living after what they experienced and took another way out of this hell. There was another event during this disaster when John Robb, a German-born businessman, and others used his Nazi party affiliation to create a safety zone. He stated, "There is a question of morality here. I cannot bring myself for now to betray the trust that these people have put into me, and it is touching to see how they believe in me." He and the others would lead to protection of 450,000 civilians, saving thousands from a grisly fate. Using his party affiliation, he would delay many atrocities, giving the Chinese time to flee the city. However, at the end of the rape of Nanjing, as it was dubbed, it is claimed that anywhere from 40,000 to 300,000 civilians were murdered, depending who you ask. In the end, the numbers are not what matters. It is the people behind those numbers who lost their lives and dignity to this violence. It is a new year, and that means new problems for everyone. For the Japanese government, this was a general loss of control of the war in China. The ever-oppressive military took the reins from them. They pushed farther into Jiangsu, attempting to take Taizerhang, which was located in the NRA 5th War Area, led by Li Zhongren and Bai Chengxi from Suzhou. Taizerhuang was a fortified town, as being in Shandong meant you were usually the stepping stone of invasions from the north and south. This would play to the Chinese advantage. Of course, this did not stop the Japanese from bombing it into the ground. The battle would begin on the 25th of March with an all-out assault, breaching the northeast gate, but being beaten back to a temple where the Chinese set it ablaze, killing all of the force. The same thing would happen a day later, except no fire this time, as they had burnt everything that was flammable, leaving the Japanese to use it as a base of operations. Brutal house-to-house fighting would ensue, though it was more like rubble to rubble. The Chinese would be reinforced by an artillery regiment and set up several anti-tank guns, which were used then to dispatch tanks. A small force of Japanese soldiers had tunneled under the walls, but were utterly wiped out by 72 Chinese soldiers, in commemoration of the 72 martyrs. With casualty rates of up to 50%, the Chinese fought on, destroying their only path of retreat and let reality sink in. The Japanese would try to break the stalemate with poison gas, but the Chinese held on. Eventually, it was time for a counteroffensive, which saw the Japanese forced to retreat, having their lines collapse. The first major victory by the Chinese of the war was won. The Japanese would change its path and make a push to Wuhan in hopes of taking it after the Kuomintang would negotiate. They would take Kaifeng on the 6th of June and looked like they would take Zhengzhou, but the Chinese had a devastating trick up their sleeves. They would blow the dikes of the Yellow River, resulting in the devastation and death for 400,000 in Hainan, Anhui, and Jiangsu, and a further 10 million becoming refugees. This would lead to a famine in the local populace to add insult to injury. The Japanese would soldier on, capturing Wuhan by the end of October. This did not open the Kuomintang to negotiate, and further resistance is the name of the game. With another change in strategy, the Japanese would begin bombing civilian targets, namely the capital at Chongqing. Make no mistake, China is bleeding, but a cornered animal fights the hardest. This war is far from over. It will only get bigger and bigger as time goes on. Many will die, and many more will bear the scars of this conflict for the rest of their lives. I hope you all learned something today, that we cannot just look at wars in the macro. We have to consider that everyday people affected by these conflicts over ideals, glory, and land. This is the deal with the devil we make for war.